Professor David Miller is a political sociologist whose work has focused, as he puts it, on, quote, the analysis of power and propaganda, especially the way states and corporations lobby to secure their interests. As a scholar and an author, he has delved into many political controversies, including ones involving foreign policy and war. But in 2021, he was fired from his teaching job by Bristol University, where he was a professor, in the wake of complaints from prominent British politicians and then by students who argued that his harsh criticism of the Israeli government and the way pro-Israel groups inside of the UK wield influence to foster pro-Israel foreign policy, quote, incite hatred against Jewish students. Exactly the same theory often invoked to justify the firing of conservative scholars on campuses throughout the West when they express heterodox and anti-establishment views on race, gender ideology, and gay issues, and then are accused of making students unsafe by virtue of the expression of their opinion. Professor Miller has appealed this decision. He's fighting to win his job back. We are delighted to welcome him to System Update to discuss his case and its implications for free speech and academic freedom. As a reminder, if you're somebody who wants to fight for free speech, the place you ought to go is not the cases where your views that you agree with are being attacked or your allies are being silenced. That's easy to do. Everyone can do that. The true test for whether you believe in these values and whether they will be strengthened is precisely in those instances where somebody is being silenced or censored for expressing views with which you disagree. So we're delighted to welcome Professor Miller to our show. Professor Miller, good evening. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Hi, how you doing?
Doing well, thanks. So let's just start at the beginning. I had referenced these series of events that culminated in your firing from Bristol University in 2021. The accusation was that you had essentially incited hatred against Jewish students at the school. Walk me through, in a kind of summary way, what the case against you was and what the outcome ended up being.
So it took about 3 years. First of all, I had done a lecture on Islamophobia where I had said that some Zionist organizations fund Islamophobic organizations, and this was too much for some students who went to an Israel lobby group who complained to the university. But the university wouldn't accept that because the lobby group wasn't a student. So they got some actual students to complain who were from lobby groups themselves, from the Union of Jewish Students, which is a Zionist organization in the UK, which is similar to Hillel in the US, for example, and the head of the union, the Jewish Society at the University of Bristol. And they complained, and they investigated me for 2 years. A QC came in, that's a Queen's Counsel, a lawyer came in and did an investigation, found that there wasn't a single thing that I'd ever said was anti-Semitic, and they dropped the case. And then 6 weeks later, I did a public meeting outside of work on a Saturday afternoon, and I referred to the fact that I had been attacked and complained about, and those were the words that I used. And then all hell broke loose. They started to complain that I was making Jewish students unsafe by simply referring to the factual matter that I had been attacked and complained about. And then a further investigation was convened by a QC, who again found that I was not guilty in any way of anything anti-Semitic. But the university decided that, nevertheless, it wasn't the words that I had said which were problematic, but it was the way I had expressed them. And they might have made some students feel unsafe, so they dismissed me.
So before we get into the kind of substance of the free speech and academic freedom implications, which is where I want to devote the bulk of our discussion, just to kind of have a full disclosure about what your actual views are, because a lot of times people say, I was fired for being an Israel critic. I think it is fair to say that you hold some views that on the spectrum of the Israeli-Palestine debate are, let's call it radical, just in the sense that it's views that the mainstream does not only share, but doesn't typically include in the debate. For example, you believe Zionism is a racist ideology, and you also believe that pro-Israel forces inside the UK wield a large amount of influence to enable the policies of the UK to serve the interest of a foreign government, which is Israel. Is that a fair characterization of your views that have been the source of controversy?
Yes, certainly I believe that Zionism is a racist ideology, has been from the beginning, it still is, always will be. And also I believe
Talk about
that
that. Just briefly describe what you mean by that.
well, so in order for the State of Israel to be created, they had to remove 750,000 indigenous people, the Palestinians, and they had to do that by force and by effectively militarily forcing them out. And of course, they can't now come back. They won't let them come back. So that in itself is a form of racism. The indigenous people were not appropriate to live there, and instead, the Jews who had come there were the appropriate people to live there. That's a form of racism. And that form of racism has continued all the way through since 1948. People talk about the State of Israel as being an apartheid regime. That's certainly the case, but it's a regime which is a settler colonial regime which cannot do anything but be racist unless it was to dissolve itself into a state of all the people of the area. So that's what I mean when I say it's racist.
No, I guess I should kind of amend what I said, which is that although those views are not mainstream in the West, there are hundreds of millions of people in the world who see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict the way you see it. They also view Zionism very similar to the way you just described it. But in the West, this is kind of a limitation on what people can get away with saying, even for those people who believe or who claim to believe in free speech. So what specifically were the claims that, or the views that you expressed that were cited as inciting hatred against Jewish students, which ultimately ended up being the way in which they kind of justified your firing while claiming that they were still upholding academic freedom? What specific views were the subject of this complaint?
So in the first instance, it was that I had said that Zionist organizations are amongst those who fund Islamophobic groups, both street Islamophobia and more elite Islamophobic organizations like think tanks, like, for example, the Henry Jackson Society in the UK. Now, that's a matter of fact, which had come out of research which I had done and which nobody has ever denied. But that was regarded as being somehow problematic. Another thing which I said, which was they thought was problematic, was that I had been attacked and complained about by a Zionist student group, and they didn't like me saying that. And the third thing was when I said that actually what we're facing here is a coordinated Zionist attack on campuses and on free speech to stop the possibility of people voicing support for the Palestinians and the Palestinian struggle. And that was the thing which particularly, I think, annoyed them, was that I referred to something called the Zionist movement, which I have written about at length, which is a collection of actually existing organizations who exist, and they call themselves Zionists, who exist to support Zionism. Now, I think this is a movement which has significant power, but in order to demonstrate that power, one has to look at particular cases and find the ways in which that power is exercised. So it's not that I think that Zionists control the world, but it is the case that Zionists have significant power. And in the case of the UK, let me just take the example of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. This is a policy weapon which was developed following Ministry of Foreign Affairs conferences over the years in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and it's an implement, a weapon of the Israeli state, and it's been adopted by the UK government, by the UK Labour Party, by 200 universities and colleges, and by many local authorities in the UK. Now that is an element of power which I think is quite significant, and I have never heard anyone say that is not a form of power by the Zionists and indeed by the Israeli state.
We've covered in the past this kind of tension that I think often appears on the right, which has taken up the free speech banner, which believes that conservative voices are being censored, not just by the government in the segment we just did, but also on college campuses in particular. And there does seem to be a tension sometimes because those same conservatives will then turn around and support the firing of people like yourself, whose views they regard as deeply offensive. The argument, though, that they make is that if someone focuses unduly on one country, namely Israel, that you're a British subject, that you're teaching at an English university, and you're speaking so often about Israel, that Jewish students are justified in believing that you must harbor some animus toward the Jewish people, or else there's no other way to explain this kind of fixation that you have, or this at least lack of balance that you have in speaking so much about Israel. What would you tell Jewish students who believe that, or how would you respond to that argument?
Well, first of all, if you look at the work which I've produced over the years, I've written, 10 or 15 books on Iraq, on HIV and AIDS, on health, on food, on propaganda. But mainly I've focused on propaganda over the years, and focused in particular on the conflict in Ireland, on Iraq, on Afghanistan, and of course on Israel-Palestine. So obsession with Israel, no, I am very interested in it, and I got interested in the question of Israel and Zionism when I was attacked for being an anti-Semite way back in about 2009 or 10, because I had started to write about neoconservative think tanks in the aftermath of Iraq, the Iraq invasion of 2003. And I didn't understand why I was being called an anti-Semite. I thought these people were mad. And so I started to look at this, and I became more and more interested in the way in which Zionism was operating, and the way in which it used lobbying tactics, which are used by all sorts of social interests. And incidentally, of course, I've done quite a lot of work, I've written books, in fact, on corporate lobbying and corporate public relations. So I know a little bit about lobbying outside of the question of Israel-Palestine. But look, the reason people are interested in Israel-Palestine is because it's a long-running conflict. And the activities of the Israeli state are exceptional. They're not are the same. I mean, the Israelis try to say, oh well, if you criticize Israel in a different way than you criticize any other democratic state, well then you're discriminating against Israel, and that must be some kind of anti-Semitism. On the contrary, Israel is not a normal democratic state, and if we actually find that empirically, then we're sort of not allowed to say that by this argument that we're somehow discriminating against Israel. Israel is a settler colonial regime. It's the same as many other settler colonial regimes, like, for example, the creation of the United States, of Canada, of Australia, of New Zealand. We're all settler colonial states. They managed to continue to be settler colonial states because they more or less eliminated all of the natives, and that's the only way that Israel can find peace is to eliminate the natives, and that's what, of course, what it's trying to do. But there is an alternative way to resolve a settler colonial conflict, and that's what you see to some extent, at least in Ireland, in the case of Ireland, certainly in the case of Algeria, and indeed, of course, in the case of South Africa. So the thing I would say about the question of settler colonialism is this is not to do with some particular quality of the Jews who happen to be particularly evil in engaging in settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is a structural form of colonialism which people of many different backgrounds can engage in, and the solution to it, of course, is decolonization.
I always think it's bizarre that on the one hand, we're constantly told by the US government, by the British government, by various Western European governments that our governments have a special relationship with Israel. In the United States, they are the recipient of enormous sums of aid each year, billions and billions of dollars worth. For me, that's what justifies focusing on Israel in a way that one would not focus, say, on a country that is not supported by the U.S. government. It becomes an extension of U.S. government policy or British government policy. I think that's an additional reason. But when I look at this debate in which you're now enmeshed, and I hear these arguments about how you're making Jewish students unsafe, the similarities between your case and the cases where a lot of conservative professors have been fired on the grounds that they make the climate or the classroom unsafe for black students or for gay students or for trans students or for any other kind of marginalized or minority group seems very similar to me in terms of its rationale. Do you see that same similarity, and do you find those cases where conservative professors are being punished or otherwise sanctioned as threatening to academic freedom and free speech as you do your own?
Well, I mean, look, the way in which our society has developed in the UK and indeed in the US, it's become much more the case. You've been talking about this for the whole show, and I know you've talked about it a lot in other shows as well. It's become the case that those on the left and those on the right are being attacked routinely by this whole apparatus of censorship, which Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberg talk about in the Twitter files. This kind of censorship industrial complex. And it focuses on the radical left, yes, but it also focuses on the right. And that when you have an organisation like this one in the UK called the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, which is a moderately Zionist organisation, and of course what it does is it writes reports on the left, including one on a show which I do on Press TV, and it writes lots of reports on the right, and it tries to justify itself by saying, well, we're looking at these very bad people, and hopes that nobody will say, hang on a minute, why are we censoring independent media, whether it's right wing or left wing? Why are we doing that? And what they hope is that we'll just go along with this, and this will be seen as protecting us, as you've been saying. Democratic politicians have been saying recently in debates. So it seems to me that we are in a new situation. It's not that there hasn't been censorship in the past, but that we're in a situation where there is a massively ramped up attempt by the security state, the censorship industrial complex, to clamp down on the possibility of people expressing views which are outside the mainstream. And of course, the mainstream remains not just a kind of liberal, nice place where we're all lovely to each other, but it remains a place where key state organizations are engaged in massive attempts to destabilize the world, as we see in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine.
Absolutely. You know, as I said in the intro, one of the things I do all the time is when I tell people on the left or even liberals who like to insist they are defenders of free speech and opposition and opponents of censorship is to purposely seek out those cases where people are being silenced when they're expressing views with which you most disagree. And that's certainly something I try and encourage people on the right to do as well. There's obviously a lot of support for Israel on the right, also within mainstream liberal circles as well. It's a very bipartisan, trans-ideological view in the West. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.